Next we come to inflation. As discussed before, inflation tends to be pro-cyclical, which means it goes up and down with the business cycle. It is important to understand the definition of inflation. Inflation is the sustained rise in overall prices in an economy. And this is a potential exam question. Let's say that the price level is initially here at 100. The price level goes up from 100 to 105 and stays there. Is this inflation? The answer is no. Inflation would mean that this price level is constantly rising. That's what we mean by the sustained rise. The inflation rate is the percentage change in a price index. And we'll talk about price indices later, but generally the inflation rate is given as an annualized number. If at the start of the year the price level is 100, end of the year the price level is 105, then we'll say that the annual inflation rate is 5%. Inflation rates allow us to infer the state of the economy, and we've seen this before. If inflation is high, then that might imply that the economy is overheated. Also, unexpected changes in inflation may trigger a change in monetary policy which can impact asset prices. This is just reinforcing and emphasizing why we as analysts need to be on top of this inflation figure. If we are tracking inflation and we note that there is an unexpected change, then we can try and predict the monetary policy response based on past behavior of the monetary authority, and we can then infer what will happen to asset prices based on that particular monetary policy. Don't need to get into too much detail on this. This is material that you will see in subsequent levels, but just recognize the fact that as an analyst, you need to be aware of what's happening with inflation, because not only does that tell you about the economy, it also tells you about what potentially might happen to asset prices. Also note that if you observe high inflation, you are also observing fast economic growth and low employment. We have what is called an inflationary gap, and this will indicate that the economy is overheated. I'm sure you remember this, but very quickly going back to aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, if this is our potential GDP, again we have price level on the Y and real GDP on the X. What we are talking about here is a situation like this. Aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, the real GDP is above potential. Here we have high inflation, price levels are relatively high. Being to the right of potential GDP means that we have low unemployment, fast economic growth. So this means the economy is overheating and chances of inflation then are very high. Here are some terms that you need to know: deflation, hyperinflation, and disinflation. Deflation is a sustained decrease in aggregate price level. So if our price level is coming from 100 down to 99, down to 98, this is deflation, a decrease in price level. Hyperinflation means a very fast increase in aggregate price levels. A rule of thumb is that over a 3-year period, if the price level doubles, so 100% or greater increase in price level over a 3-year period, that is generally referred to as hyperinflation. And finally, disinflation means a decline in the inflation rate. So if in a particular year you have a 15% inflation rate, in the next year you have 12% inflation rate, and then 10% inflation, the price levels are going up but at a decreasing rate. Another way of putting it is that the actual inflation number is positive but less positive. This would be an example of disinflation. I can imagine an exam question that checks whether you understand the difference between deflation and disinflation, and I hope it is obvious. With deflation, the price level is coming down. With disinflation, the price level is going up, but at a decreasing rate. Measuring inflation, the construction of price indices. A price index represents the average prices of a basket of goods and services. As we see in the equity component of this course, where we talk about equity indices, there can be different kinds of equity indices. There are different ways of weighting the constituents. The same concept applies over here. With equity indices, the constituents are stocks. Here, the constituents are actual physical goods. So the question becomes, how do you weight them? What rules do you use? And we have different sorts of indices depending on the rules which are used. The most basic and most commonly used index is a Les Perez index. This is created by holding the consumption basket constant. So for example, if we have a given consumption basket which consists of a certain amount of bread, so let's say 10 loaves of bread and 5 liters of milk. If at a later point in time the consumption basket is changing from 10 to 12 loaves of bread and from 5, let's say, to 6 liters of milk, what we assume with this kind of index is that the basket stays the same. Obviously, prices will change. Let's say that bread is 100 per loaf, and for simplicity, we'll say that milk also is 100 per liter. Then 1 year later, let's say the price of both has gone up to 110. So we can then say that the price level has gone up by 10%. We will only use the same quantities that we had initially, and we'll do an example later where we actually calculate the price index as well as the inflation rate. Recognize that with this strategy where we hold the consumption basket constant, a few biases can creep in: a substitution bias, quality bias, and new product bias. To understand the substitution bias, let's look at a simple example. Say we have a basket of goods which is defined such that we have 5 units of fruit and 5 units of vegetables. Let's say that fruit becomes very expensive, which means that people will change their consumption pattern. And if fruit is expensive, people might come down to 2 units of fruit and 8 units of vegetables. So this is what people are actually consuming now. But with an index which assumes a fixed basket, our price level will be computed based on 5 units of fruit and 5 units of vegetables. So therefore, the inflation number or the price level based on this strategy will be biased upwards, or we can say that it will be overstated. Quality bias, this also will cause the index to be overstated because the quality of goods and services tends to get better. If you take the example of cars are getting a little more expensive, but the quality is probably increasing more so than the increase in price. If we use a regular index which is based on a fixed basket, that does not capture the improvement in quality. It is only capturing the increase in price, and that again causes the index to be biased upwards. New product bias, this means that new products which keep entering the market do not get into the consumption basket because our consumption basket is fixed, and this also creates an upward bias. We have another type of index called the Pache index, and this allows for the composition of the basket to change. And finally, we have a Fisher index which uses the geometric mean of the above two indices. Now let's work through this example which will illustrate how we calculate the index values. I want you to actually calculate the index values and then also show the inflation rate. Here is what we do for the Les Perez index, and I know I'm probably killing the pronunciation here, but that doesn't matter too much. So the quantity is 7 and 10. We multiply that by the price, and this is our number. But we are told to set the base period to 100, and we are saying that this period, January 2012, is our base period. To convert 1630 into 100, we divide by 1630 and multiply by 100. Next period, we will use the same quantity. We keep the basket the same. So we have 7 and 10, but we use the new prices, 110 and 120. When we do the raw calculation, we get 1970, but we again need to bring this back to a number such that it can be compared with 100. So we do the same thing over here, divide by 1630 and multiply by 100. So the price index has gone up to 121, from 100 to 121. So the inflation over this period is 21%. This is according to the Les Perez index method. With the Pache index, we consider the current basket. So for sugar, the quantity used is 9 kilograms and not the old value of 7 kilograms. Similarly, for milk, we use the current value of 12 liters. Now, the calculation then involves 9 and 12, both for January and February, because even though this is the current month, for the previous month, we are going to use the same quantities as what we have in the current basket. The prices obviously need to be used based on what was valid in that month. In January, the prices were 90 and 100. So we'll do 9 into 90 and 12 into 100. These are the prices for January. When we do this calculation, we get 2010. For February, the prices go up. So here we are going to use 110 and 120. So here the value comes to 2430. Now, as before, we need to standardize this to 100. If January 2010 is the base month, then we can take this, divide by 2010 and then multiply by 100. So that will give us 100 over here. For Feb, we take this number, divide by 2010, which is this value, and then multiply by 100, and that will give us 120.9. So the index value went up from 100 to 120.9. So the inflation is 20.9%. The Fisher index simply represents a geometric mean of these two numbers. If earlier we calculated 120 under the Les Perez method, and now we have 120.9, so the Fisher index will simply be the geometric mean, which is the product of the two, and then we take the square root. Price indices and their usage. Most countries use their own CPI to track inflation in the domestic economy. CPI stands for Consumer Price Index, and the basket of goods here would consist of consumer goods. That's why it's called the Consumer Price Index. Weights of different categories vary across countries. The point here is that a consumer price index in India versus a consumer price index in America will be different because the specific constituents might be somewhat different, and the weightage of those constituents will definitely be different. For example, with the CPI in India, food and beverage represents approximately a 47% weightage in the overall basket. Food and beverage in the United States is a much lower percentage. You don't really need to know all the percentages, just recognize the fact that the weightages are different and the specific categories might be different across countries. And to get a sense, you can look at Exhibit 6 in the curriculum. There are several different kinds of price indices, and every price index will have a somewhat different scope. In the United States, we have one particular index which is called CPI-U. This stands for Consumer Price Index Urban, and this gives an indication of the price of consumer goods in urban areas. We have something called PCE, which stands for Personal Consumption Expenditures, and this covers all personal consumption in the United States, and we come up with this number using business surveys. Then we have another index called PPI. PPI stands for Producer Price Index, and this reflects the price changes experienced by domestic producers in a country. And the way you can think about it is changes in PPI, which reflects the prices of inputs for firms. If PPI is going up, then eventually the CPI will also go up. So to get a sense for what will happen to CPI, analysts also track PPI. CPI numbers are extremely important because many economic activities are indexed to a price index, such as the CPI. If we take Treasury inflation protected securities or TIPS, and we study these in fixed income, there the bond's par value is adjusted based on the CPI. The monetary authority or the central banks of countries use the CPI to monitor inflation. Now I want you to go over these examples which explain the different kinds of inflation. They talk about sub-indices, relative prices, and then example 13 is particularly important because it actually gives you some MCQ questions. It is important to understand the distinction between headline inflation and core inflation. Headline inflation covers all goods and services in an economy. With core inflation, we exclude the prices of energy and food items because prices of energy and food tend to be very volatile. As an analyst or a policy maker, if you are looking at short-term trends, then you would probably consider core inflation. But for policymakers, the ultimate goal would be to control headline inflation. A sub-index is a price index for a particular category of goods. For example, we might have a sub-index purely for food or a sub-index for energy. Relative price is the price of a specific good or service in comparison with those of other goods and services. In a given country such as the United States, the prices of food might be low relative to the prices of other goods and services, whereas in other countries the prices of food might be high relative to other goods and services. Explaining inflation. On this slide, we will talk about what triggers inflation. Broadly speaking, we can either have what is called cost push inflation or demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation results from a decrease in aggregate supply caused by an increase in the real price of an important factor of production such as labor or energy. Just to connect this with the material we saw in the previous reading, if we look at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves, this is our potential GDP. What we are saying is that if initially we are at this point, this is our short-run aggregate supply curve, this is our aggregate demand. If there is an increase in commodity prices or if there is an increase in wage rate, then the short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left, and notice that that will cause upward pressure on prices. If upward pressure is coming because of increases in input prices, then we say that this is cost push inflation. As analysts, we will look for increases in commodity prices which might cause this shift, or what is more common is that we will have increases in labor prices or increases in wages which will cause the left shift. As we've discussed before, when an economy is overheated, so here our unemployment number is very low, that will cause upward pressure on wages. So what metric do we look at? The two metrics that the curriculum mentions are shown right here. Non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. This is also called NAIRU. If unemployment falls below this level, then there will be inflationary pressures. We don't need to get into the details of what that level might be because this level will vary from economy to economy. Or we also have a metric called the natural rate of unemployment. This is often written as NARU. If unemployment falls below this level, then there will be upward pressure on wages. These measures are important and useful, but have their limitations, and you as a well-rounded analyst need to understand those limitations. One limitation is that the appropriate level below which pricing pressure or wage pressure kicks in, that level might change over time. The other issue is that these metrics don't consider bottlenecks in specific segments of the labor market. So for example, let's say that the demand for skilled computer resources is very high, but the supply is low. Clearly then the prices or the wages of computer resources will move upwards, higher wage, but that particular segment might not be reflected well in these particular measures. So recognize these two weaknesses. Another point that you need to understand is the relationship between productivity and unit labor cost. As productivity goes up, the unit labor cost will come down, and this is fairly evident. Higher productivity means that per unit of labor, more goods are being produced, which means that in a particular good or service, if we look at the percentage of cost that represents labor cost, that percentage becomes lower as productivity becomes higher. And what that means is, even if wages do go up, given the fact that we have higher productivity, higher wages are less likely to cause upward pressure on price levels. So simply looking at higher wages is not enough. We also need to look at whether productivity is going up when we are trying to determine whether or not price levels will go up. Now do example 14 from the curriculum. Demand pull inflation results from persistent increases in aggregate demand that increase the price level and temporarily increase economic output above its potential of full employment level. And using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply level, here is what we do. So this is our potential GDP. If at a given point in time we are over here, so this is our real GDP, which is in my example below potential, and then for some reason aggregate demand gets a boost. Let's say that there is monetary policy which pushes more money into the system, or interest rates are reduced, so aggregate demand will shift to the right. And then people have more money, so they spend more, consumption is up, so aggregate demand shifts further to the right. When we have higher inflation or higher price levels explained by increases in aggregate demand, then we say that we have demand pull inflation, because inflation is being pulled by the aggregate demand. As might be clear here, if our actual GDP is at potential or above potential, then that will result in shortages and bottlenecks. We will be at very high levels of utilization. Labor will be overworked, so it makes sense that prices will increase. The monetarist perspective is that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. The simplistic explanation here is that if monetary authorities increase money supply at a very high rate, let's say at a rate higher than the growth rate of potential GDP, then we have a large amount of money chasing a relatively small amount of goods and services, and obviously then price levels will go up. As analysts, if we believe in this theory, then we can compare growth in money with the growth of the nominal economy. If the growth in money is higher, then we can expect inflation. Now I want you to read example 15, which talks about the velocity of money. We will conclude section 4 by talking about inflation expectations. Inflation expectations can be self-sustaining, or we can say that inflation expectations are a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everybody expects inflation to be 10%, in other words, people are expecting the price level to go up by 10%, then automatically labor will demand a 10% increase in wages and prices will then go up by 10%. This is a simplistic explanation, but it does illustrate the fact that inflation expectations are important and in a sense they are self-sustaining. As an analyst, you need to gauge inflation expectations. And how can you do that? One thing you can do is look at past inflation rates and use that to gauge inflation in the future. Connecting this material with what you see in fixed income securities and other parts of the course, inflation expectations are extremely important, and when we talk about the nominal yield or nominal return on bonds, the inflation expectation is built into those nominal returns. Now I want you to do example 16, which is extremely important. This has several MCQ type questions, so make sure you spend time on them.